Evening, everyone. My name is Lori Cohen. I'm the Director of Continuing Education at Gratz College. If you're not part of our webinar, could you please turn off your video? Would you mind doing that for us? Thank you so much. So thank you for joining us. Today, Dr. Patricia Chappine, the Gratz Holocaust and Genocide Studies instructor, will present Women in the Holocaust as Rescuers and Resistors. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to direct your attention to a couple of other upcoming programs at Gratz. And by the way, we have, while I'm thinking of it, we have over 130 people registered tonight for this webinar. So that's really lovely, especially considering the stormy evening that we have. Consider if this was a lunch and learn or a program at Gratz right now, we wouldn't be able to do it. We might have to cancel it. So I think it's wonderful that that we can have this online tonight for everyone. Anyway, on Wednesday, June 16th, we are having the Honorable Elizabeth Holtzman, a former US representative, will present the program Nazi War Criminals in America. She will recount the historic 40+ year effort that she led to bring them to justice. And this is part of an endowed lecture series of the Finestone Lecture. On June 29th, we invite you to the next Gratz at Home presentation. This program is presented by Dr. Roberta Rosenthal-Quall, the Raymond P. Nero Professor at DePaul University College of Law. Dr. Quall brings us the program, Is Cultural Judaism a Myth? She will explore the development of Jewish law over the centuries, as well as the implications of the intersection between Jewish law and culture for 21st century American Judaism. I hope you'll join us for that program. I wanted to mention that in addition, registration is open for the summer semester of continuing education classes at Gratz. So please don't forget that you can take these classes whether you're home, at the beach, or even in another country. We have plenty of people who are watching even from Israel right now during the semester. And more information about the classes and the programs I mentioned will be sent to your email after tonight's program. Now for tonight, if you have a question for our speaker, please type it inside the chat function. I will moderate your questions at the end of the program. We are recording this session right now, and we will email you a link to it after it has been processed and edited. You'll also receive an online survey soon after the presentation ends. We appreciate your input as it helps us improve your experience for future webinars. Now let's get to our program for this evening. Dr. Patricia Chappine is an adjunct professor in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Gratz College, as well as other universities. At Gratz, she has taught classes that explore the role of gender in the Holocaust, Holocaust denial, and the cooperation between private industry and the Nazi regime, which is really quite fascinating. And I hope one day she'll be teaching a course for us, a continuing education class about that. On a personal level, I want to mention that Dr. Chappine has an avid interest in military history, especially with women, and she wrote the 2015 book, New Jersey Women in World War II, which is available on Amazon. So now I would like to welcome Dr. Chappine.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here with me. So for my first trick, I'm going to successfully share PowerPoint, so we'll see how that goes. And I'm going to go through, and I do have a video, so let me just share the screen with you. And you're not going to see me for a little bit, but then I will be back for the questions. Okay, so with women as rescuers and resistors, there's really a lot of different areas I could have covered. So what I did was I had a little bit of an overview on the topic and the different implications, and then I go into a couple what I believe are interesting stories. It was really difficult to pick certain stories because there really were so many very compelling things that I could have talked about. So these stories are by no means comprehensive. I just picked those out because I find my students responded to them in particular, more so than a lot of the other stories that I could have put in here, but like I said, it's just a very, very small representation of the different ways that women served in rescue activities and as resistors. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview, just kind of touch on the subject. So the topic of women in resistance activities and rescue efforts is really an offshoot of an initiative to look at the Holocaust through what is referred to as a gendered lens. Now, what this means is that men and women experienced events differently depending on the social norms and the constructions of the time. So Myrna Goldenberg describes this as experiencing different horrors, but the same hell. For instance, within descriptions such as memoirs or even in post-war interviews, men and women focused on different experiences and even used distinct coping mechanisms. One thing that springs to mind is that women tended to form surrogate families while in the camps. And in that way, they kind of gave themselves one reason to survive for another person. So there are many different ways in which men and women described how they survived. So that's one way we can view this as a gendered form of kind of looking at women and men as having a little bit of a different experience, even if the experience was the same. So with this in mind, I'm going to use this presentation to give a concise overview of the unique experiences of women. And as I give an overview of resistance and rescue, I also want to highlight just a few of the many individuals who engaged in these activities. So does that look okay? Just let me know if anything looks messed up on your end. So with resistance, now according to Yad Vashem, resistance involved, and this is a direct quote, a wide range of acts that directly or indirectly defied Nazi laws, policies, or ideology. Such activities always endangered the lives of those engaged in it and were taken by both non-Jews and Jews, by men and women. The final solution did not distinguish between men and women. However, women experienced the degradation and humiliation differently, and therefore are worth studying as a separate group. So stereotypes of women as passive and unthreatening actually sometimes prevented them from being suspected as part of resistance movements. So it actually worked in their favor in some cases. In addition, Jewish women often had more contact with non-Jewish neighbors and were slightly more familiar with Christian Moors. And this could actually help them if they needed to assume a false identity. So for these reasons and others, women were able to resist the Nazis in different ways than men, both spiritually and physically. Women who could pass as German could move around and engage in information gathering, smuggling, and other activities that required them not to be seen by the Nazis. Women who were involved in socialist, communist, or Zionist youth movements often engaged in resistance activities. And we'll talk a little bit more about the partisans later, because I have one particular woman who wrote a memoir about her experience in a partisan unit, but some women actually escaped to the forests of Eastern Europe and then joined partisan units. Some worked with the French resistance, and some even resisted the Nazis from within concentration camps. And I have a particular story that we'll talk about a little bit later in mind with that. Okay, so what are the different forms that resistance activities could actually take? The details of women who engaged in resistance show a really wide range of different activities, from active armed resistance to courier experiences and to more personal and spiritual resistance. So all of these different areas could be considered resistance. Couriers were usually carrying information into and out of the ghettos. And in partisan units, women sometimes engaged in armed resistance, but most of the time they served as, let's say, nurses, or they were just basically running the camps. A lot of partisan units didn't allow women and children into their ranks at all. So this really varied depending on the partisan unit. And within the ghettos themselves, resistance could take on many forms along a spectrum, including personal resistance, trying to continue an education for the children, for instance. A lot of cases, social activities were attempted, and there was just this idea of trying to continue some kind of life, even within the confines of the ghetto. So any of those things could be considered resistance. And this quote I just thought was really great from Nahama Tech. She said, even in rare cases when a woman brought a weapon to the forest, it was confiscated. Guns belong to men, not women. So she wrote a book years ago with the partisans, and she talks a lot about women and their roles, but in a lot of cases, women only made up about 10%, they're estimating, of partisans that were active during the Holocaust. So it's a very small sampling, but they had very unique experiences even within those groups. So while it was a rarity that women were armed in these partisan units, it did happen. And in fact, Faye Shulman, who is one of the women I'll talk about a little later, was actually an armed member of a partisan group in Eastern Europe. So within these partisan groups, women took on domestic tasks like cleaning and cooking. They served as nurses, they transported weapons, and even went on reconnaissance missions occasionally. So of the 10%, they were a really integral part of these partisan units. So this is one particular instance that stood out. It was a revolt that happened at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. And, not only was it amazing because these were people that were, under armed guard, and they were emaciated and, had very little to really, they knew once they got caught, they were probably going to be killed. So this was an act that involved the men and women. So what the women ended up doing is the ones that worked in the munitions factory actually were able to smuggle out very tiny amounts of gunpowder. And they sewed these little seams, like hems, into their uniforms so that they could smuggle out this gunpowder without being detected. So on October 7th of 1944, the Sonder commando working at the crematorium in Birkenau, they heard a rumor that they were going to be killed. And months previously, the women had been smuggling out these tiny amounts of gunpowder and then handing it off to the men of the resistance. What ends up happening is the men then blew up the crematorium. And it actually, if you've ever been to the Auschwitz Memorial in Poland, the rubble is actually still there. So they never rebuilt it because it was, towards the end of the war anyway, but it never ended up getting rebuilt. So they actually just memorialized it at Auschwitz by leaving the rubble there. So then these women that actually had something to do with smuggling the gunpowder out, Esther Weisblum, Ella Gardner, and Regina Saferstein, were the ones that were questioned. Another woman, Rosa Rabata, she helped to transport the gunpowder, and they actually were all killed for this. So there's an interview that I want to, and hopefully it's going to work. It's a 2-minute interview with Esther's sister, Anna, who also helped, but she was not questioned. So she actually was able to survive. So I'm going to click on this and then share the screen with you.
In October 44, there was a revolt in the crematorium. The Sonderkommando, those were the people who were manning the crematorium, knew that from time to time, after a certain period of work, they were being murdered as not to bear witnesses. And that particular group decided that they are going to rebel. They used this gunpowder and manufactured little hand grenades made out of metal round boxes of shoe polish with a wick and filled with gunpowder. And when you lit it, it exploded. I don't know how much damage it did or it didn't. This revolt that took place on October 7, 1944 was abortive. Either they were betrayed or whatever. All the Sonderkommando people were killed. But the crematorium was destroyed as well. So there were 4 crematoriums in Birkenau, and one was destroyed by this. After the revolt, the Germans found these little handmade grenades, and they identified the gunpowder, which of course we didn't know that gunpowder has some special characteristic. They identified this gunpowder as coming only from the Union and only from Pulverraum, where my sister worked. They started an investigation. They imprisoned 4 girls, Roja Robota, Alla Gärtner, Regina Saperstein, and Esther Weisblum. They tortured them mercilessly and eventually hanged them publicly on January 5th, 1945.
Okay, and there was actually one of the there's a memoir written by Rose Rechnick and she talks about this because she was actually related to one of the women, and her memoir is called "Try to Survive and Tell the World." So if anyone has a chance and you haven't read it, that's a good one, especially if you're teaching like middle high school students. So that revolt happened, and like I said, the rubble is still there, so you could still go and view it. And they actually, I mean, who knows how many people they saved by stopping that crematoria from functioning. So that's just one instance, and you know, amazing that could actually take place while they were confined into a camp and under such strict guard, and the fact that they were so malnourished and abused. So that's one of the stories of active resistance that happened within a camp. So I have 2 more short clips. I was didn't know if we were going to have time, but I think we'll have time to at least do one of them. So Faye Shulman, who you can see in the center, she wrote a memoir called Partisans Memoir, and it's available on Amazon if you're interested. But she recounts the stories of what happened when she actually escaped her town. She was one of the very few people to survive from her hometown of Lenin, Poland. And what ends up happening is she encounters this group, and because they needed a nurse, even though she had no medical experience, but because the idea was that she could learn, and as a woman she was viewed as being nurturing, so they decided that she was going to be involved in nursing activities and things like that. So her backstory is that before the war, she lived in Lenin, Poland, like I said, with a pretty big family. And she learned photography to help her brother, who had a photography business. So in August 14th, 1942, the Nazis actually came to Lenin. They had already instituted a ghetto in that area, and they ended up killing basically the entire population of that area, about 1,800, a little over 1,800 people. And this included Faye's whole family. And because Faye had this, knack for developing photos, she was actually spared at that point. So the Nazis made her develop photographs of the massacre, and she did this, but then she also secretly made copies so that she would have evidence after the war. So during a partisan raid on this area, she took that chance to run into the forest, and then she later joined the Molotov Brigade, which was a group of members of the Soviet army that had escaped. So she was a nurse for the group for a while. During a raid on her old hometown, she actually discovered her old camera and took that with her. So she would actually take pictures, and this is one example of pictures of the partisan unit. So she's really got one of the most comprehensive photograph collections of the partisans as they were out in the woods. So she took over 100 photographs of just that partisan group. And whenever they would, have a close call with the Nazis, she would bury the camera and the equipment and then come back for it later. And she always ended up recovering this camera, which was absolutely amazing. But so she describes some of these experiences in these interviews, which I'm going to show you.
Jewish people were fighting back. They didn't go like lamb to the slaughter. And there is a new monument now in Israel, and it's called in the honor of the partisans. And it says it's engraved in the cement 16 countries that Jewish people were fighting. Now at 65, 70 years, I still remember how to make my own developer. 6 ingredients. It's in me, it's my life. It's so important for me to remember. And all the time, the camera, I didn't have to schlep them. When I had to go in attack, the camera was buried in the ground. All my stuff, the photography was buried. And I did it because for me, photography, that was my life. It was the light, the electricity was the campfire. This was my electricity. And dark was because it was night. And water, I have to bring a lot of water. So I have to go to look for a river or whatever, bring water, all the pictures, and the negatives has to be washed a lot because 65 years, 70 years, and my negatives are still like yesterday. So it wasn't easy, but I tried to do the best. And I volunteered to every attack and every ambush because I needed photo supply, medical supply. So that was my job.
Can I ask you a quick question, Faye?
So, I mean, if you buy the book, and I don't think it's very expensive, you could also find the photos online, because I found quite a bit of her photos online. So it's not absolutely necessary to buy the book, but I mean, they really did come out very well, and it's a very rare historical representation of life in partisan units. So, I mean, it's definitely worth taking a closer look at if you do have a chance or you're interested. So we're just going to do the one interview, not push our luck. So one of the books, and it's been a while now, but Carol Rittner did a book called The Courage to Care. And then she also did a documentary companion to that book. So, I mean, it was one of the very first introductions I actually had to that topic way back when I was an undergraduate. I studied with Dr. Rittner for quite a while. So one of the things that stood out for me were the different stories. And, you know, when usually there at some point in the interviews, they asked, you know, why these people did what they did. And many of them just kind of said, why wouldn't we? So, you know, that always stood out to me. But Elie Wiesel, I feel like this is a great quote, and this is included in the book, The Courage to Care. And he said, in those times, there was darkness everywhere, in heaven and on earth. All the gates of compassion seemed to have been closed. The killer killed and the Jews died, and the outside world adopted an attitude either of complicity or of indifference. Only a few had the courage to care. These few men and women were vulnerable, afraid, helpless. What made them different? Why were there so few? There's always a moment when moral choice is made, and so we must know these good people who helped Jews during the Holocaust. We must learn from them, and in gratitude and hope, we must remember them. So I just thought that always stood out for me as a really powerful quote. And Yad Vashem honors what they call the righteous among the nations. So this was established, and the picture is the Avenue of the Righteous, where the trees are planted in honor of those who rescued Jews. So this was established in memory of both the 6 million Jews lost during the Holocaust, but then also the people that went out of their way to attempt to rescue. So in 1963, they started this task of trying to recognize non-Jews who risked their lives in these rescue efforts. And when they do find these heroes, basically, the medal actually says that whoever saves a single life saves an entire universe. And over half of those recognized currently by Yad Vashem are women. Marion Pritchard is one of those women. She was also in Dr. Rittner's book, The Courage to Care. And I don't think I'm gonna have time for the interview, but if anyone wants the PowerPoint, I can definitely send it to you. just let me know. I'll give you my email address. But so Marion Pritchard was a Dutch social worker, and it's estimated she helped to save about 150 Jews, mostly children. What ends up happening is there's one particular story about Marion Pritchard that was really stood out for me. So she was inspired to help when she witnessed Nazis actually throwing Jewish children into the back of a truck. And in an interview, she describes the situation as follows, and this is a quote from her. She said, "It was a beautiful spring morning, and it was a street I had known since I had been born. And all of a sudden, you see little kids picked up by their pigtails or by a leg and thrown over the side of a truck." So she watched as two women tried to stop the men, and they were then thrown into the truck and disappeared. So at one point during her rescue efforts, she actually killed a Dutch policeman to protect 3 Jewish children she was hiding. So she was living with these Jewish children and their father, and the policeman brought Nazis to the home, and they did an inspection, but they failed to find the children, who were hidden in a secret compartment underneath the floorboards. However, Pritchard recounted, and this is another quote from her, she said, "An hour later, after I let the children out, because the youngest, 2 months old, was crying, the policeman came back alone. I felt I had no choice but to shoot him." So she killed the policeman, and then one of her friends actually enlisted the help of a baker. So the baker came to get the body, and then they had an undertaker agree to bury the body on top of another person. So they actually hid this crime, and she was never arrested for that. After that, she continued to hide children and arrange host families to keep them safe. Sometimes she even forged documents and, helped to transport them by herself. So during the course of the war, she engaged in a lot of rescue activities that put her in direct danger. And when you ask her about it, she would basically say that, do you think that that we should help each other or not? And, she just didn't see any other way around it. She just didn't see herself not helping. So that's just, her story always stood out because she does describe regretting that she had to kill the policeman, but she always said she would do it again because she knows that those children would have been taken away and they would have been killed. So you could tell she struggles with it. She did. She passed away, but she struggled with it. So another woman, Countess Maria von Maltzan. So she had a unique story because she had a wealthy family, so she could get away with a little more than other people could. So just because of economically, she was a little more well off, she was able to kind of, do things that others wouldn't have been able to do. So she was engaged in resistance activities from very early on. So 1933 is when, the Nazis gained power in Germany. So, before World War II even began, she was engaged in resistance activities. She did things like falsifying paperwork, and she would personally drive people to safety outside of Berlin. And she hid Hans Herschel, who was involved romantically with her. She married after the war, and they eventually got divorced, but one incident in particular always stood out when reading about her. So she got visited by Nazis, and they searched her home, and Hans was inside hiding. She had hollowed out a couch for him. So what ends up happening is the officers, they go in and they asked her to open up the sofa bed, and she claimed that it was stuck because Hans was in there. And with this kind of feigned confidence, Maria said that if you don't believe me, then go ahead and shoot through the couch. But she said, I insist that you pay for the damage. And I want to note that, basically giving you responsibility for paying for the couch. So, they luckily left, and Hans ends up surviving the war. But it was things like that where she just kind of used anything that she could to basically bluff her way out of these situations. But she ended up saving about 60 Jews, it's estimated, by the end of the war. And Irena Sendler, also in the Courage to Care. She was another social worker like Marion Pritchard, and she was also a nurse. So estimates are that she saved about 2,500 children. She used her credentials as a Polish social worker to enter the Warsaw Ghetto and then smuggle children out. So not only did she do that, but she had aides working with her, other rescuers, and together it's estimated that they forged about 3,000 documents to help Jewish families get out. And she finally ended up joining the children's division of the Polish Council to Aid Jews. And besides getting the children out of the ghetto through different ways, she would use a sewer, she would use an ambulance. There was a way through the courthouse, or she would hide them in a trolley. So she used a lot of different ways to smuggle children out of the ghetto and then get them to safety. In 1943, she actually got arrested, questioned, and tortured. And during the questioning, she even had her legs and feet fractured, and she was scheduled to be executed, but other members of the Polish underground had bribed the executioner to let her go. So posters about her death were actually circulated, and she had survived. So she stayed hidden for the rest of the war. And another initiative that she started was that once she placed Jewish children with families, she wanted to make sure that if it was possible, if they survived the war, that she would be able to return them to their families. So she actually hid the names and any information she had about these children in jars that she buried, and then she went and dug them up after the war, and then began the process of trying to, get them resituated and, put back with their rightful families. So there's actually there's a project online about her life that students actually started, which is really amazing. If you just search "life in a jar," the whole project will come up, and there's so many primary sources. It's really just wonderful what the students ended up doing. And Irena Sendler actually communicated with them after she found out about it, and she was just amazed that anyone would take such an interest in her life and what she did during the war. So it's definitely worth looking up. It's a really great story. And another good resource is if you go on holocaustrescue.org, they actually have a lot of different information on individual rescue. They have things like country by country and organization lists, and they actually study rescue and altruism and things like that. So if you're interested in Holocaust rescue, beside Yad Vashem, of course, it's a wonderful resource. So that is it for the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing, and if you have any questions, please feel free.
So before we get to questions, I really wanted to thank you, Dr. Chappine. I can tell that you are really committed to this material. That is very clear. And I hope to hear more about the topic, maybe in a future continuing education class with you.
Great.
And I do see we have some good questions, some comments. Before opening it up to those, I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in tonight, especially in this lovely evening outside. If you would like to help strengthen Graz and make it possible for more students across the world to participate in our online programs, please consider making a tax-deductible charitable donation. And on behalf of everyone, thank you for your support. So I can see that we do have a couple of questions coming in. They've come in quickly towards the end there. So I see something from Stephanie. She says, a teacher in Kansas, Norm Connard, his students started the project of publicizing the story of Irena Sendler. Is that related to the life in a jar, or is that a different set of students? Do you know anything about that?
I believe that's the same group of students, and now it's become a huge project. But yeah, that was originally a group of students that just did a school project, and then that's what ended up happening. I put my personal email down there. If anyone wants me to send the PowerPoint or any other information, then feel free to contact me. I'm glad to hear from you.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely. So in what country do you think that rescue was most successful, and why in that particular country?
Well, successful is difficult, but I feel like there were a lot of rescuers in Poland, for instance. That's one of the highest areas that were, recognized by Yad Vashem at least. So it really depended. There were so many factors that could influence the ability to resist. So it could be close proximity to the way the Nazis were moving through Europe. So for instance, Poland was very early. So they were occupied for a longer period of time. So in that way, it all depended on when and where the Nazis were. In France, for instance, it was a little later on, and there were a lot of strong resistance movements that already were, on the ground running in France before it was taken over. So it depended geographically. There was a different story. Italy is often, it's interesting because I feel like for a long time, because Italy was, with the Axis powers, that people didn't look at rescue in Italy, but there actually was rescue in Italy too, even though they were technically, looking at the war, they were on the side of the Germans. But there were instances of them refusing to even the Italian army refusing to round up the Jews when the Nazis asked. So the Holocaust in Italy was, a different instance altogether too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Patty.
You're welcome.
I do have a question from Tracy, and it sounds like it's a long one. It's a little bit in depth because she is a 2004 graduate with a master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So she's right up your alley there. She says that her thesis centered around women of the Bielski partisans. So her question to you is, besides possibly the Vilna partisans, do you know of any other substantial armed resistance by Jewish female partisans in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, and like with Faye Shulman, for instance, a lot of times in the ones that were populated by former Russian POWs, they were actually, because Russia actually did allow women to use guns, during the war in general. So I feel like they may have been more inclined to, just from their personal experience. Like there were a lot of instances where the Soviets had women engaged in a lot more armed resistance, and this isn't resistance, but if you look up the Soviet night witches, they were actually the pilots that terrorized the Nazis. So that's a great story. The Nazis were terrified of them. So I think that any Soviet brigade was more accepting. And then a lot of times it was about the weapons that they didn't have. And if it was between a man having a gun or a woman, it was usually going to be a man. So a lot of times it was just short supply. And a lot of the women didn't end up in the forest at all. So like I said, maybe about 10% of partisans were women. So.
Sure. I'm sure the men grabbed those guns as soon as they saw them.
Exactly, and the ammo. So it was all in very short supply.
Would you say, were there any groups of women that were more prominent in the rescue and resistance, like in terms of groupings, like Zionists or socialists? Other than the Russians, which obviously as partisans, right. Were there any specific groups?
Usually younger people, and by younger people, maybe in their early 20s. And this is men and women usually, because the ramifications on the family were something to really consider. And the fact that oftentimes if you were caught engaging in resistance activities, they could target your family, and there was that fear. So a lot of times when that, they weren't concerned with it, not that they weren't concerned, but that they didn't have families of their own, maybe their parents were already gone, they were already killed or taken to a camp. So a lot of times the age had a lot to do with the ways in which they resisted and were able to engage in rescue efforts.
So you think the age more so than an ideological reason?
Yeah, and the ideological, I feel like the youth have these activist passions anyway. So I feel like, and there's the example of, the White Rose with the, Sophie Scholl, and that college age kind of seemed like it was more prone to that resistance and rescue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I do see messages in the chat of people who want you to send your email address again. They must have lost it, but I can also send that out in an email later on this evening.
Yeah, it's really easy. It's just my first and last name at Gmail. So it's just Patricia Chappine, nothing else at gmail.com.
That's great. That's great. We have so many chat messages here. I haven't seen them all yet. But, so there's one for you personally. How did you become interested in studying rescue during the Holocaust? And what's your background with this?
I'm going to blame Dr. Rittner when I was at Stockton completely for this. She actually got me interested in teaching and going to grad school. And she just, I was not a very interested undergrad in much of anything that was going on. I was floundering. I, just thought I needed to go to college because that's what you do after high school at that point. But the way she taught the Holocaust and the way she got me interested in the questions of ethics, I just, I was just very interested in all of it. And I wanted to learn more, and I could finally see myself doing something that mattered and, hopefully made a difference. And, if I could do that with even a handful of students, the way she inspired us, then, then the education was worth it.
Right. And I should mention that you pushed it all the way for an uninspired undergrad. You pushed it to a PhD, and now you're inspiring young teachers, no less, to teach this to others. So, good work there.
Yeah, see, I was capable. I just needed to find what I was passionate about.
Yeah, like all of us.
Right.
I have some other questions. In America, outside of the war zone now, so we're talking about America, were any women or women's groups involved in any rescue efforts?
Well, there were actually active Jewish women's groups in the United States that were at least trying to send aid. So while they couldn't really do anything with armed resistance, there were a lot of relief efforts going on here. And, attempting to, even on an individual level, the attempt to get family here, to be able to help them immigrate was a big deal. And it was something that, not a lot of people were able to do. But yeah, there was a lot of funding. There was a lot of attempts in America, at least with the different Jewish social groups, men and women, where they attempted to help. Yeah,
absolutely. There's a comment here that says, "I know that many partisans would not allow Jews to join." Mm-hmm. So were the Soviets more likely to allow Jews or any others?
And you hear stories about the Soviets not wanting Jews to join either. So I feel like it depended on the particular unit. But yeah, there was a lot of anti-Semitism even in partisan units. And that's why in many cases the Jewish people established their own, because they then wouldn't have to fear violence from, other groups. So sadly, the violence wasn't only coming from the Nazis. So there was that fear as well.
That's really being in a difficult situation and not knowing who your friends are.
Exactly.
That's a very challenging situation. Here's a very specific question for you. I don't know if you know this or not. The question is, are the people who sustained Anne Frank's family among the righteous of the nations?
I'm not sure. I have to look that up.
Sure.
I feel like I knew that they were, but I don't want to say it because I'm not positive.
Well, that's very specific. So in these partisan groups, how did they get their weapons? Where'd they get them from?
Yeah. A lot of times they would just raid towns and take them. And that's the way they would get food in many cases too. So they would, if there were towns near the forests where they were kind of roaming around, then they would raid the local towns. I know the Bielskis, and sometimes they actually would kill people that they knew were collaborating with the Nazis. So a lot of times the supplies, they would make supply runs and they would go into local towns and get things that way.
So robbing from one to...
Yep. And then sometimes people would give them food. Like there were sympathizers that would actually help them, and they wouldn't have to go be forceful about it, but in some cases they would. So
It's really incredible. I think there's a comment here. The Bielski group established their own group in part due to Jews being killed by Polish partisans. They weren't safe in non-Jewish units. So that seems to be a common thread with this. Also, just that Yad Vashem recognizes over 7,000 Poles as rescuers. And I guess that's the highest number in any country. Is that right?
Yeah, Poland leads in the most rescuers they recognize.
I wonder if that's because so much damage was done there.
Yeah, and it was very early that they invaded. So it was a longer period where they were occupied.
I have to say, I don't, well, maybe there are a few more messages. I have a couple of my own questions here, but we have one. Were there other women like Hannah Senesh who went back to Europe to attempt rescue?
It depends. I mean, there were a lot of people, and one of the examples that, she's not Jewish, but Marlene Dietrich, who was, she was a German citizen. And then she came over here and ended up getting American citizenry, and the Nazis were not happy about that. She was viewed as a traitor, and she actually would go back and perform for the troops in, overseas as an entertainer to boost morale. So, and then she was in direct danger. So, I mean, there were a lot of instances where people did try to aid by actually going in. There were a lot of journalists that attempted to find out what was going on. Sadly, a lot of their stories are not known to us, or they're not popularized. But yeah, there was a lot of information was a very big deal, and the ways in which people attempted to get information, because the idea was that, if people knew, then there would be more help, there would be more aid possible. And sadly that didn't happen much, at least. So.
Well, I have to say that we're now crowdsourcing answers. And so in the chat, from the question about Anne Frank, we have Fred Davidale, who says that, and I will slaughter the pronunciation here, that Meep and Jan Guys are the righteous. They aided the
Good.
Frank
Thank
family.
you for verifying. It was going to bother me. I was going to look it up after.
We have a lot of smart people on this call.
Thank you.
Here's another question. Do you think that a movie or book like The Reader is too sympathetic to Nazi women?
No, I haven't seen it or read the book, so I don't know. I can't comment on that.
Okay.
Right. A lot of times I don't watch, made for Hollywood movies or, book adaptations, because I guess and my husband tells me I'm annoying with the fact checking. I watch a historical movie. So now he won't watch it with me. But yeah, I get there are very few that I'll actually watch, because the liberties that they take, I find with history, usually I'm not supportive of. So, and in case in point, there's been with Schindler's List, the way that, his wife was downplayed during that, for instance, among other things. But, it's in a lot of cases, people just use those movies as history, and it's, you try to tell them not to, but I feel like,
Yeah, they turn it into historical fiction, which is still fiction, and it's not accurate. And there really is so much good documentation out there and so much primary source material that there's no reason to go to that type of thing.
Yeah, I don't know why people don't like documentaries. They're so dynamic now. I mean, the filmmaking in documentaries is really come a long way. So I don't know why we have to, take so many liberties with historical stories. That's Hollywood for you.
Exactly, that's Hollywood. So I want to take this opportunity right now to say that, so a lot of the people who are listening and watching are continuing education students. Some of them may have degrees from Graz as college students, as graduate degrees, and some of them don't. And so this is a great opportunity, since you are an instructor in our Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, to kind of to introduce you, as well as to kind of ask you, what else are you teaching for grads, and what else kind of piques your interest? What classes within that arena?
Yeah, well, what I love about teaching for grads, one of the many things is that they allow you to propose courses, and they're always trying to expand the courses that they have. So I've gotten an opportunity to create a lot of courses, which interests me. So that's always great. A lot of times you just take whatever, a school will give you in the way of courses, but I've been able to really, show my passion. So this summer is the first time I'm teaching a course on Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. And we're gonna do a lot of focus on the current social media climate, and, also go back into historical denial and things like that. But I feel like especially today, in an age of misinformation, that it's particularly relevant. So that's one that's upcoming in summer session B. I also teach one on Nazi Germany and corporate collaboration. So that one's, we talk about all the different businesses and then the court cases that occurred after the fact. So, the quest for restitution after these companies that, let's say, they engaged in slave and forced labor. They were the ones manufacturing things directly used for the war effort and for the Holocaust. So we deal with a lot of companies, some of them American companies, Ford and things like that. And then I teach women in the Holocaust also. So exciting things.
That's a good variety of things.
Yeah.
There are several.
Patty, can you hear me? I wanted a class on denial. When are you teaching it?
In summer B session.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that's a graduate level class. Also, that's not a continuing education class, but it could be, because we're here tonight to try to convince Patty to teach for continuing education for us. There are a few messages in the chat, which I won't go into all of them, but just really highly regarding the documentary Final Account, which features interviews with older Germans, including some women discussing their memories. And I guess it's both a book and a film, and several people are saying how lovely it is, and that it's I would recommend that to everyone who is listening right now, Final Account. And I believe we have about 5 minutes left, and we do have a special guest in our participants tonight. We have Rabbi Lance Sussman. And I think we were trying to see if he had a few words to say, and I was going to see whether or not we could get his video on. So we're going to see if we can work that out. It looks like we can, so that's great. Welcome, Rabbi Sussman. Oh, we can't hear you though. So let's see if we can unmute you.
Now.
That's great. Thanks for joining us. This is an extra special gift to us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you, Professor.
Hello.
I just want to compliment you on your knowledge of primary sources and facts on the ground. People often speak about the Holocaust in such broad strokes and general terms, and you really bring it down to the ground level. It's truly outstanding, and I thank you for it. But the opposite of that would be when you look at gendered studies, and that it became active, as I think you said, in 1983, has it really turned the ship in Holocaust studies, or is it still pretty much a male-focused enterprise in academia?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's still very male-focused. And there's been a resistance since the idea of the gendered study has occurred in scholarship. So in the 80s, when this was first proposed that we should look at women's experiences, there was kind of this backlash that occurred. And the solution was kind of just to then look at women's memoirs and then not really go too deeply into the ways in which women differed. And so that's become, it's become a lot more mainstream. I think the literature is there, but I feel like, yeah, it is still very focused on the male experience. And some of the most prominent memoirs that you still see are, Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. So but the field is growing. They're consistently coming out with new scholarship, which, you know, it's amazing. So.
And if I'm permitted, one more, Laurie, is that acceptable?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, because I know others had asked questions too. In terms of studying Nazi women, what does the field of scholarship look like? I know there's been books on Nazi motherhood, books like that. So we're looking at mostly the Jewish side, the victim side tonight. But I think gendered studies has also kind of redrawn the picture of what was going on the perpetrator side. I was wondering if you just kind of characterize where you think the scholarship is going in that direction.
Yeah, I think for the first time you're seeing a consideration of the role of women as perpetrators. And I think for a long time, the way that, you know, women were conceived socially as nurturing, and that if someone engaged in perpetrator behavior, it was, you know, the exception, and it was something that, you know, was a unique individual thing. And, you know, you have these monsters that, you know, people like to talk about. But I feel like now that lens is kind of lifting, and people are looking at that, you know, women were perpetrators. They were enthusiastic Nazis during that time. And they're considering the many different tangible things that happen, rather than kind of focusing on the social ideas about what they think should have happened. So for a long time, it was an uncomfortable subject to consider women as perpetrators. So that veil is lifting more and more.
Veil is lifting.
Yeah.
Again, thank you for your scholarship, and thank you for being part of the Gratz community, both our students and community people. You've offered us a tremendous amount of new information tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. It was nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Sussman, so much. And we are kind of running towards the end of our time, but I do see several comments just talking about what a wonderful presentation this has been this evening. And I do want to thank you so much, Patty. It's been lovely getting to know you tonight. I think everyone out there would agree with that. And I do hope that you're going to join us with a continuing education class sometime in the fall. So that's my hope. So, and to everyone out there, I thank all of the participants tonight. Thanks for inviting Gratz inside to your living rooms and your offices and dining rooms, your dens and everywhere. So everyone have a very good night, and it was very good to see everyone tonight. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.